Hello, my name is Mike, and today we're building a 4MS Quad Pingable LFO kit. It comes in this kind of takeout style box. Let's go ahead and open it up. This video is not sponsored. I paid for the kit with my own money, and the background music to this video was made featuring the Quad Pingable LFO. This build gets a bit complicated towards the end, and overall it took me about 6.5 hours to build. The kit comes with a glossy, illustrated color poster of all of the components. Here, there are 4 different color LEDs taped to the poster, and without those labels, you wouldn't really be able to tell which color is which. They all appear to be transparent. My kit did not include a printed set of instructions. At first, I thought the included poster was the instructions, or at least as much instruction as you were going to get. However, there are step-by-step instructions available online at the 4MS website. I actually started my build without those instructions, so the first thing I wanted to do was break apart the PCBs. The actual instructions don't have you doing this until much later. I hesitate here because the boards seem very sturdy compared to other PCBs I've broken apart. But I can tell by the front panel that these boards do need to come apart. I began to wonder if I was going to need a utility knife to cut these apart, but then I'm finally able to break them apart without any tools. I start taking inventory of the first bag of components. All of the resistors are loose and unlabeled in the bag, so I need to sort them out as best I can, and while I'm doing that, I might as well sort out all these other loose capacitors and resistor arrays and everything else. At this point, I turn off my soldering iron because I won't be soldering anytime soon, and I pull out the multimeter to help measure and sort the resistors. I start placing the resistors on the PCB just as a method of sorting them out. At last, it's time to solder. The resistors are in place, and now I have the instructions in front of me. I accidentally skip over the diodes and move straight to the IC sockets, but I'll get back to those diodes later. The 8-pin sockets have a bit of an unusual geometric shape, and it's hard to suss out which end is the one with the notch. Next up are the resistor arrays. There's one 6-pin array that needs to be oriented a certain way, but the rest of them can go in either way. At this point, I realized I had previously skipped over the diodes, so I do that right now while I'm thinking of it. The striped side of the diode must go in on the same side as the tip of the arrow printed on the PCB. The online instructions include a handy photo. The legs of the diode feel thicker than the hole they go through. I'm having a tough time with it, even with pliers. Now it's back to the resistor arrays. The remaining arrays have codes on them that do not match what's in the instructions. By process of elimination, I know what they should be, but I want to make sure I didn't get the wrong parts, so I bring back the multimeter. I confirm that the 6-pin arrays are 1 million ohms, and the 8-pin arrays are 1000 ohms. Next up are the voltage regulators. There is a larger one and another smaller one that looks like a transistor. There's also a 10K trim pot. The large voltage regulator goes in vertically and then gets bent back until it lays flat against the board. Next, the instructions tell us to do the male header pins, so I start sorting them out. I find that I'm missing one of the 2x3 pins. I start emptying the bag of all other components, hoping that it turns up. I double check the inventory poster to make sure it says I'm supposed to have 11, and at this point I'm worried that I'm going to have to quit this build until I can get a hold of a substitute. I confirm that the PCB has spots for 11 2x3 pin headers. Now I'm trying to figure out if I can live without some of these pin headers. I think I could have, as some appear to be for hooking up to other 4MS modules in the quad clock distributor family. After thoroughly searching the area, including the floor, and then rechecking everything yet again, I finally find the missing 2x3 pin header jammed up inside one of the 1/8 inch jacks. It's stuffed in there so thoroughly that I need some pliers just to pull it out. After all that, I decide to skip a few steps and do the female shrouds instead. In general, I find it easier to get the female shrouds placed flat on the board, solder those in place, and then plug the male header pins into the shrouds when I solder them. This ensures that everything lines up. The way I'm doing it is fine, but the trade-off is that I will have to be more careful when adding the capacitors later on. I will need to make sure that my soldering iron doesn't get too close and melt the plastic on any of the shrouds. Now I'm placing the male headers into the female shrouds, and then putting the PCB over the male headers to solder them in place. Now I'm pulling the boards apart. And now I'm continuing on with the rest of the male header pins. Next up is the Ferrite bead. The Ferrite bead is shaped like a resistor or diode, but it is placed on the board vertically. Now we're moving on to the capacitors. I'm starting off with the non-polarized ceramic capacitors. The 0.01 microfarad capacitors are bundled together on a strip of cardboard, but the other capacitors are just loose in the bag. After sorting out the electrolytic capacitors, the remaining 0.1 microfarad ceramic capacitors are identical to the 0.01 microfarad capacitors, except they have the number 104 printed on them. When placing the capacitors, it is very important to take the time to distinguish the 0.01 UF markings versus the 0.1 UF markings printed on the PCB. This is the point when I have to be careful not to melt the female pin shrouds. If I had followed the instructions in the manual, they wouldn't be here yet. I'm fine with my method, but it's up to you to decide which way you're more comfortable with. The best of both worlds might be doing these two capacitors right before soldering in the female headers. Now we move on to the polarized electrolytic capacitors. The longer leg must go into the hole marked positive. With the capacitors done and the female headers already in place, the manual now advises that we inspect everything. After this point, it will be harder to get at a lot of these joints. I think I see some socket pins that I missed, but after I hit them again, they still look the same, so it might just be a trick of the light. These connections on the control board will be covered up by knobs and jacks, so it's important to be extra thorough when inspecting them. I trim down anything that might cause trouble later. Now the instructions tell us to put a hex nut on each of the 1/8 inch jacks and finger tighten them. After having already done this, I would advise that after you do this step, take a break, and then come back and finger tighten them again in reverse order, starting with the last one you did first. There are 16 jacks, and it's easy for your fingers to get fatigued when you do them all in a row. Later on, I will wish I had done this, because I suspect some of mine are less finger tight than others. These nuts will go under the faceplate, and you want them all to be at the same level. Now we are placing the 1/8 inch jacks, but we do not solder them yet. There's one pin that's smaller than the others, so that's how you can tell how these jacks are oriented. Moving on to the potentiometers, the instructions say to break off the extra tabs, but I lucked out. My pots don't have any extra tabs to break off. We place 2 washers on the post of each potentiometer, and then place them onto the PCB. Once again, we are not soldering anything yet. Now there are 8 buttons. According to the instructions, 4 have a yellow marking and 4 are black. The side with the marking is negative, and the buttons must be properly oriented on the PCB. It is a very good idea at this point to go ahead and click some of the buttons to get an idea of how they feel. I did not do this, but later on when we add the faceplate, we need to be sure that the buttons aren't rubbing against the side of the faceplate. There is some inherent resistance to these buttons, so it would be good to know how they feel before you add the faceplate into the mix. I noticed that my buttons have yellow and black markings, but the PCB labels say orange and white. Looking at the photos in the instructions, I determined the buttons with the black markings go into the PCB where the label says white. Therefore, the buttons with the yellow markings must go where the labels say orange. I should also note that the pins on the buttons are very flimsy and move around easily. I'm checking over everything to make sure it looks right. Now we move on to the LEDs. All 4 LEDs look clear, so they're taped to the poster next to their color. It is very important to do these one at a time and not mix them up, otherwise your colors won't match the faceplate. The worst thing that could happen here is if you place all 4 LEDs and then they fall out and you don't know which is which anymore. That would be disastrous. Now we place the faceplate over the buttons, pots, jacks, and LEDs. Now I begin adding nuts to the 4 corner jacks and pots and adjusting them to keep the faceplate flat. Every time I add a new nut, I have to check the others to make sure everything stays properly aligned and that the buttons aren't rubbing against the faceplate. With all the nuts and washers underneath the faceplate, it doesn't feel like we have very much room for screwing the nuts to the jacks to secure that faceplate. I feel like I need pliers to get the top layer nuts tightened. This part gets a bit finicky. We need the nuts underneath the faceplate to hold it up flat without an angle. At the same time, we also need to make sure the buttons don't rub against the faceplate when they're pressed. This gets difficult, as there is an inherent resistance to the buttons, and I had not familiarized myself with it before putting the faceplate on. Definitely make sure you know how these buttons feel before you put the faceplate on, as that will remove a lot of uncertainty. This whole thing becomes a balancing act, where you're trying not to tighten things so much that they skew the faceplate one way or the other. This is where I wish I had double-checked the bottom nut on each jack to make sure they were all equally finger tight. Per the instructions, I solder one leg of each LED in place. It is very important to make sure each LED is properly aligned with the corresponding hole on the faceplate. Now I add nuts to the 2 other potentiometers and then solder the middle leg of each potentiometer in place. Next, I solder one leg of each potentiometer and one leg of each button. If I find that one of the buttons is not properly aligned and it's rubbing against the faceplate, I need to resolder that one leg while pushing against the button on the other side of the PCB so that it lines up properly. Now that I finally have the buttons properly aligned, I'm tightening the nuts for the potentiometers and, according to the instructions, adding the knobs on top of the pot. Adding the knobs now seems a bit strange, as that's usually one of the very last things done in a build. Here I realize I was supposed to have soldered the corner jacks back when I soldered one leg on each potentiometer. I very carefully solder the corner jacks now and check to make sure that the faceplate stays level and that the buttons don't become misaligned with each step. Next, I solder the LEDs so that I can clip the excess legs and get them out of the way. Now we screw in the nuts to the rest of the jacks. I'm checking the buttons one last time to make sure they still do not rub against the faceplate before I solder the rest of the legs in place. There's two buttons I'm a little unsure about, so I go ahead and adjust them one more time while I still can. I feel pretty good about where they are right now, so I solder the remaining legs on the potentiometers and jacks. About halfway through the remaining jack legs, I check the buttons again just to make sure that they still feel right. It's a bit hard to balance the PCB with the buttons and knobs, so I use the handles of my wire cutter and pliers to try to hold the board in place. I solder the remaining legs of the buttons last. Now we place the ICs. The instructions include photos of how to properly orient each IC chip. Fatigue is real. I accidentally placed the ATTNY2313 chip where the 74S1053 chip goes. It's a lot more work to pull these chips out than it is to double check and place them right the first time. It's always a good idea to take a break between steps. Now we add the two jumpers per the instructions and then put the boards together. This is a very thick and hefty module. I almost forgot to test the power pin's continuity to make sure there are no shorts. Now we test the module. Alright, we're going to test this out. We're going to power on. Here's my power supply. Got some lights. Looking good.
one of those flashes. Let's go ahead and hook up an oscillator. Oh gosh. I don't know how to use this yet. That's fun. Let's get some PAMs going on in here. Oops. So yeah, quad Pingable LFO. Looks like it'll be lots of fun.
Thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed this or found it useful, please consider liking and subscribing. Have a great day.